The Greatest Threat to Our Civilization. Introductory lecture on Islam by Srđan Trifković. Is our civilization in peril? And is it possible that today's America and the Western world in general, ostensibly more powerful and more affluent than ever, are actually in mortal danger? There are many people who would say yes, but for different reasons. Some see the danger in catastrophic climate changes that may render our planet unfit for human life. Others point out that our environment is being degraded at an unsustainable rate, that we are not preserving the earth for those countless unborn billions of humans who will inherit it from us. Others yet warn that even if we take better care of the environment as a whole, the ongoing depletion of natural resources will lead to the collapse of the global economy, with the most cataclysmic political and social consequences naturally felt in the developed world. The list of other potential calamities is long and sometimes eccentric. A mega epidemic of a deadly and incurable disease is, of course, more plausible than extraterrestrial invaders, but the probability of these other scenarios is low, and the scope for timely counteraction is considerable. But even if you're an optimist who believes that the environment can be protected and energy renewed and diseases cured, even then you'd be mistaken to think that we are relatively safe, that there is no need for alarm and immediate action to save our civilization from annihilation. For there is one threat to our system of values and our way of life that is real, present, and deeply committed to either converting us or killing us. The most deadly threat facing the Western civilization today is Islam, a teaching that is part religion, part totalitarian ideology, and part blueprint for global conquest. Now, let me state right away that I am not a prophet of doom, and I do not have much sympathy for those monomaniacs who have been heralding the end of the world in one form or another for centuries. In world affairs, I'd call myself a Jacksonian realist. I believe that the war on terror is a just and necessary endeavor. Of course, my concern is that Mr. Bush's war is somewhat misnamed. He confuses the jihadist enemy with the terrorist tool he uses, which would be the same as waging World War II, not against the Nazis, but against their military tactics, such as the Blitzkrieg. More seriously still, the war on terror is waged without a proper assessment of the enemy, of his real character and real strength. To make that assessment in a rational and pragmatic manner, devoid of ideological blinkers, is the purpose of these remarks of mine. The best way to determine the course of a war is to look at the offensive potential of the warring parties. After Stalingrad, it was obvious that Germany was doomed. For the remaining 2 years of bloodshed, the Reich was on a downward slide that ended in the ruins of Berlin. After the debacle at Vienna in 1683, the Ottoman Empire rapidly and irreversibly declined. After Gettysburg, the Confederacy bravely fought on for 20 months, but it could no longer hope to take the war to the Union's heartland. No such luck with Islamic terrorists. Over 3.5 years into the war on terror, their backbone is far from broken. They are stronger, more numerous, more widely spread, and generally more dangerous today than in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Some plots are and will continue to be discovered in time. Others are anticipated, and a few will succeed. It is a safe bet that for every jihadist in custody, there are a few more at large, and that we'll see more New Yorks and Madrids in the months and years to come. Top administration officials remain upbeat about winning the war on terror, but on this form the Western world cannot afford to continue winning it for much longer. The global reach and operational capability of Islamist terror cells is growing. Jihad is alive and well. It is capable of simultaneous attacks in different countries and continents, and it presents a growing threat to the United States. Let's just look at some of the more prominent Islamist attacks since 9/11, And of course, we do not count those in Iraq, Russia, and Israel because they combine elements of Islamism and nationalist insurgency. In December of 2001, Kashmiri Muslims attacked Indian parliament. And on December 22nd of that year, Richard Reed, also known as Abdul Rahim, was subdued while attempting to destroy AA Flight 63 by detonating his shoe bomb. In April of 2002, we had the Ghriba synagogue attack in Tunisia that killed 14 Germans, 6 Tunisians, and a Frenchman. On May the 8th, attack on a bus in Karachi that killed 11 Frenchmen and 3 others. On June 14th, bomb attacks outside U.S. consulate in Karachi that killed 12. And on October the 6th, French tanker Limburg was bombed in Yemen. Also, we had kidnapping and murder of journalist Daniel Pearl. In October of 2002, a bomb in Bali that killed 202, mainly Australians. In November, a Kenyan hotel bombing that killed 16. And then 2 anti-aircraft missiles were fired at an Israeli airliner leaving Nairobi, and so on. It is a safe bet, as I say, that for each and every of these attacks, Al-Qaeda and its loosely connected offshoots will field another second generation of terrorists, many of them born to the Muslim diaspora in the Western world, who will be more successful than those sent from the Arabian heartland. The decentralized pattern of new threats makes counter-terrorist measures exceedingly difficult. There is no command and control system to disrupt. Self-motivated groups of young men and women are deeply embedded in Western host societies. They are able to travel freely by holding Western passports, and they are ready to die so that the infidel may die. Let's just look at some of the specific names of Western citizens of Middle Eastern origin who have been arrested, apprehended, or otherwise involved in terrorist plots over the past 4 years. Most prominent of all, of course, is French citizen Zakaria Moussaoui, who was arrested in Minnesota in connection with the 9/11 plot. And then British shoe bomber Richard Reed, also known as Abdul Rahim, who tried to blow up an AA flight over the Atlantic. John Walker Lynn, Yasser Assam Hamdi, and dozens of other US and West European citizens were captured in Afghanistan. In 2003, US Army Sergeant Hassan Akbar threw a grenade into a tent with fellow soldiers in Kuwait, killing an officer and wounding 13. The Portland Seven, including 6 Muslim U.S. citizens, Mahir Hawash, Jeffrey Leon Battle, Patrice Lumumba Forbes, Ahmed Ibrahim Bilal, Muhammad Ibrahim Bilal, Habis Abdullah Saib, and Martinique Lewis were convicted in Oregon of plotting attacks against Americans. British citizen Asif Hanif in 2003 blew himself up at a Tel Aviv bar, killing 3, injuring 65. His accomplice Omar Khan Sharif, also British, was found dead at a Tel Aviv beach. In 2003 and 4, Mukhtar al-Bakri, a naturalized U.S. citizen, and 5 US-born youths from upstate New York, Shafal Mossad, Faisal Galab, Yahya Goba, Yassin Tahir, and Sahim Alwan, were convicted of aiding al-Qaeda and plotting attacks on Americans. In 2004, 8 UK-born British citizens, aged 19 to 35, Diran Barot, Nadim Tar Mohammed, Mohammed Naveen Bhatti, Abdul Aziz Jalil, Kaisar Shafi, Omar Rahman, Junadi Feroz, and Ziaul Haq were charged in London with plotting attacks on financial institutions in the United States. Mr. Bush and other administration officials may be right when they claim that most of al-Qaeda's senior operatives have been captured or killed, but the claim is essentially meaningless. Well over 1/2 of Viet Cong's activist corps of 1965 were dead by the end of the war in Vietnam, but fresh recruits from an inexhaustible pool quickly replenished their ranks and ensured eventual victory. The war on terror is not going well, and the proceedings before the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, otherwise known as the 9/11 Commission, demonstrated much that is wrong with its basic assumptions. It is time to ask, and the Commission did not do that, does our immigration policy make sense, and what is the true nature of Islam? The Commission has asked all kinds of supposedly hard and probing questions of top officials past and present, but in all those hundreds of hours of testimony, it never probed the fundamentals of policy and history that may explain the problem of terrorism and therefore help prevent new tragedies. Two primary areas of major concern remain unexplored: this country's immigration policy and the reality of Islam as a teaching and as a historical record. The existence of a large Muslim diaspora in the United States was treated as a given. And yet, it is the existence of the multi-million-strong Muslim diaspora in the US and in Western Europe that provides the terrorists with the recruits, the infrastructure, and the relative invisibility without which they would not be able to operate. A mere 40 to 50 years ago, this would not have been the case. Countries were assumed to belong to the traditional nations that had inhabited them for generations, fought for them, and in the case of the West, made them prosperous and powerful. But the ideology of multiculturalism and the hunger for low-cost labor has brought millions of Muslims into the West. With them soon came hundreds of mosques and Islamic centers, financed mostly by Saudi and other Middle Eastern oil money, that all too often preach the hatred of infidels and the hostility to host societies. In our nation of immigrants, this is the only large immigrant group that is often reluctant to embrace American values and that harbors a substantial segment of individuals who share the key objectives with the terrorists, even if they do not all approve of their methods. A sizable minority of them wishes to transform the United States of America into a caliphate and to replace the Constitution with a Sharia by whatever means. A coherent long-term counter-terrorist strategy, therefore, must entail denying Islam the foothold inside the West. But the notion of cultural and religious criteria in determining the eligibility of prospective immigrants is ideologically unacceptable to the dominant liberal establishment. Closely related to the lack of debate on immigration is the failure of our mainstream to address the phenomenon of Islam in general, and in particular to examine Islam's impact on its adherents as a political ideology and a program of action. The notion that terrorism is an aberration of Mohammedanism and not a predictable consequence of the ideology of jihad reflects a firmly rooted consensus in our academic, political, and media establishments. Were it not so, former President Clinton would have been asked to explain his statement to the United Nations General Assembly, made almost exactly 3 years before 9/11, that, I quote, "there is no inherent clash between Islam and America," end of quote. Were it not so, President George W. Bush would have been asked to explain his often repeated assertion that Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance, and that Islam is fully compatible with liberty and tolerance and progress. There are two possibilities here. Either Presidents Clinton and Bush and others knew the truth about Islam but pretended otherwise for political reasons, assuming that we should quietly understand their need for diplomatic prudence, or else they meant what they said, and the media regarded their statements as unremarkable and therefore unworthy of scrutiny. The former could have been the case in another era, when Western decision-making elites shared an instinctive understanding of who they were and what they were defending. Had these leaders of half a century ago striven to draw the distinction between the moderate mainstream communists and the extreme communists, the subversive fringe, back in the 1950s, the Cold War would have been lost to the Soviets. But luckily, Truman, Eisenhower, MacArthur, and others had a robust sense of the self. that sense, sadly, no longer applies in today's multiculturalist paradigm. And for that reason, neither the present administration nor its immediate predecessors could develop a coherent conceptual image of the adversary, without which there could be no viable anti-terrorist strategy. Clinton's hope to co-opt Islam into a consumerist post-national global village is indistinguishable from Bush's hope to domesticate Islam under the aegis of a non-denominational deism. Both approaches have failed, and both will continue to fail. The roots of that failure are in the nature of Islam, which may become clear to those who read the Quran, and I would certainly encourage you to do so. Islam is more than just a religion. It is, first and foremost, a religious doctrine, but also a self-contained world outlook, a way of life that claims allegiance of all believers, a radical political ideology that mandates violent action known as jihad, and, of course, a legal system. Unlike the Torah or the Gospels focusing on God revealing himself through Christ, the Quran is not a revelation of Allah, but the direct revelation of his commandments and the communication of his law. Muhammad introduced the 5 pillars of Islam that are the basis of its practice: prayer, fasting, almsgiving, the pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj, and last but by no means least, the participation in the holy war, jihad. A bona fide Muslim has to follow them all. It is noteworthy that all but one, and that is jihad, are rooted in pre-Islamic pagan beliefs and practices. Jihad is Muhammad's one fully original contribution to humanity. It was elaborated in the last 12 years of his life, following his historic escape from Mecca to Yathrib, later known as Medina. During this time, Muhammad had progressively transformed himself from the founder of a small sect into the leader of a violent cult, and finally into the head of a totalitarian state. The metamorphosis was complete when Muhammad revealed that when Allah decides to destroy a people for transgression and disobedience, he destroys them utterly. And here are some of the other noteworthy Quranic quotes. O Prophet, rouse the believers to the fight, and slay the infidel wherever ye catch them. The destroying does not happen all by itself, of course, and Allah orders the believers to make sure His will is done. The Quran promises that 20 Muslims would vanquish 200 unbelievers. The faithful must fight the unbelievers, and the end of the fight is possible only when there prevail justice and faith in Allah everywhere, the two, of course, being synonymous. The vanquished must pay the jizya, poll tax, with a hand of humility. Once it is all over, the victors, good Muslims, inherit the lands and property of the vanquished. At the time of Muhammad's birth, Christianity had covered, outside Europe, the ancient Roman province of Asia, extending across the Caucasus to the Caspian Sea, Syria with the Holy Land, and a wide belt of North Africa all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. For all of them, as well as the Jews, the Zoroastrians of Persia, and the Hindus and Buddhists of India, the heirs to the most advanced civilizations of that time, a long night descended with Muslim conquest. Muhammad's practice and constant encouragement of bloodshed, pillage, rape, and mutilation, amply legitimized in the Quran and its traditions, are unique in the history of religions. He imbued his followers with a profound belief in the value of bloodshed as opening the gates of paradise, and prompted Muslim rulers of infidels to refer to their prophet's example to justify mass killings, looting, and destruction. That Muhammad believed in uniting theory and practice was confirmed in the manner he applied his injunctions, starting with the destruction of 3 Jewish tribes of Medina. Already in his lifetime, the founder of Islam had thus established the model for subsequent relations between Islamic conquerors and non-Muslim subjects in all times and all places. We are often told of the increased frequency of anti-Semitic incidents in Europe today, but it is seldom pointed out that in most cases the perpetrators are non-Europeans, Muslim immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East, and their European-born descendants. They follow a well-established tradition. Mass murders of Jews by Muslims, inaugurated by Muhammad in Medina, continued in the 8th century in Morocco, where Idris I wiped out whole communities. In the 9th, Baghdad's Caliph al-Mutawakkil designated a yellow badge for Jews, setting an early precedent, and synagogues were destroyed throughout Mesopotamia. The list goes on to our own time. The danger for Jews in the Arab world became even greater at the time of the troubles in Palestine, during and after World War II. It was accompanied by open collaboration of some Arab leaders with Hitler's Germany, such as their spiritual leader Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. In Iraq, the cleansing commenced in 1941, when 180 Jews were murdered in a Farhud pogrom in Baghdad, triggering the mass exodus of Jews from Arab countries. In the early 1940s, there were close to 1 million Jews throughout the Arab world. There are only a few thousand left today, mainly elderly. The number of Jewish refugees from the Arab world exceeds the number of Palestinian refugees since the time of Israel's founding. If the life of Jews under Islam was on the whole not as harsh as those of Christians, this was because they were not perceived as a threat. They did not have a potential source of loyalty or support in the outside world. The difference was one of degree, not of kind. The view of modern Islamic scholars that, quote, Islam must rule the world, and until Islam does, we will continue to sacrifice our lives, is neither extreme nor remarkable from the standpoint of traditional Islam. Traditional Islam sees the world and treats it as an open-ended conflict between the land of peace, Dar al-Islam, and the land of war, Dar al-Harb. The Muslims may contemplate tactical ceasefires, but they must never abandon the jihad short of the unbeliever's submission. According to the Quran, quote, those who believe fight in the cause of God. For the fallen and victorious alike, the rewards are instant and plentiful, and we quote from the Quran again. Let those fight in the cause of God who barter the life of this world for that which is to come. For whoever fights on God's path, whether he is killed or triumphs, we will give him a handsome reward. End of quote. In the ensuing centuries, what has happened to the Christian majorities, reduced to minorities in the Middle East, North Africa, Bosnia, and Kosovo, has also happened to the Hindus in the Indian subcontinent. In 1941, in what would become Pakistan, there were approximately 25% Hindus and 30% in what would later become Bangladesh. In 1948, only 17% in Pakistan and 25% in Bangladesh, a bare 1.5% in Pakistan today, and less than 10% in Bangladesh. The pattern is the same all over the Middle East and elsewhere wherever Islam has established predominance. It is remarkable that in this era of rampant victimology, the persecution of Christians and Jews by Muslims has become a taboo subject in the West. A complex web of myths, outright lies, and deliberately imposed silence dominates it. 13 centuries of religious discrimination, causing suffering and death of countless millions, have been covered by the myth of Islamic tolerance, a myth that is as hurtful to the few descendants of the victims as it is useless as a means of appeasing latter-day jihadists. The upholders of the myth of Islamic tolerance are primarily secular Western freethinkers who hate persecution and discrimination, sexual, racial, religious, or any other, with one exception, when Christians are the victims. While Islam differs in its details from other utopian ideologies, it closely resembles them in scope and in ambition. Like communism and fascism, it offers a vanguard ideology, a complete program to improve man and create a new society, complete control over that society, and cadres ready, even eager, to spill blood. In all cases, the lust for other people's possessions and power over their lives have been justified by an ideology that perverts meaning of words, stunts the sense of moral distinctions, and ultimately destroys souls. The Western world has refused for decades to take stock of this phenomenon and to devise defensive strategies. In the final phase of the Cold War, the strategy of support for Islamic ambitions in pursuit of short-term political or military objectives of the United States government, notably in Afghanistan, has helped turn Islamic radicalism into a truly global phenomenon. The underlying assumption of Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the author of this policy, was that militant Muslims could be puffed up, used, and then eventually discarded, like Diem, Noriega, the Shah, the Contras. But it did not turn out that way. For most Muslim countries, demography is a political weapon. They export surplus population to Europe and America, aware that the bigger the diaspora, the greater the potential influence it will exert. Maintaining the loyalty of this diaspora has been a top priority. The result? 20 million plus inhabitants of the European Union are Muslims today. If present trends continue, including an ongoing demographic collapse of Europeans, by 2020, Muslims will account for over 10% of the population of Europe and exceed 10 million in America. This population is expanding by immigration and an enormous birth rate. In 30 years, the Muslim population of Great Britain rose from a mere 82,000 to 2 million. In Germany, there are 4 million Muslims, mostly Turks, and over 5 million in France, mostly North Africans. There are 1 million Muslims each in Italy and the Netherlands, where there had been none a generation ago, and close to 1 million in Spain, that is more than in the last 2 centuries of the Caliphate of Cordoba. An eighth of all babies born in EU countries are Muslim today, but in France that proportion is twice that high. With the expanding numbers and the creation of distinctly Muslim neighborhoods in many European cities, the bold notion of conquest by demographic rather than military means has entered the activists' minds. The blueprint was developed over 2 decades ago, in 1981, when the Third Islamic Summit Conference of Kaaba adopted the so-called Mecca Declaration. It started, among other things, "We have resolved to conduct jihad with all the means at our disposal so as to free our territory from occupation. We are convinced of the need to propagate the precepts of Islam and its cultural influence in Muslim societies and throughout the world." End of quote. In the ensuing 2 decades, 2 new mosques were opened every week somewhere in the Western world. Pledges to propagate Islam were advanced, irrespective of the fact that the signers of the declaration openly oppressed non-Muslim communities in their own lands or prevented them from being established in the first place. Radical Muslims, such as the leaders of CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, dominate the Islamic life in the West, to the point that moderates, even where they exist, hardly have a voice. The extremists control major Muslim organizations, a majority of mosques and newspapers. They manipulate the public and politicians hiding under non-profit religious charities and the buzzword of human rights. This reality is denied by the multiculturalist establishment, producing a climate wherein it's easy for the Muslims to lie about the true nature of Islam. Defense against such lies is difficult when it is deemed insensitive to respond to them with facts and in plain language. This refusal is justified, as we know, by sensitivity and multiculturalism. The Americans need to abide by the provisions of due process, by the Constitution, and by the principles of decency and fairness that are inseparable from the American character. But they also need to save that unique character, to save their country, which would become a very different country if Islam is allowed further inroads. The open-ended population explosion in every predominantly Muslim country in the world provides the context of immigration trends, prompting the conviction among many Muslims that tomorrow belongs to them. The totalitarian nature of Islam makes the threat different to degree to that faced during the Cold War, but not in kind. It demands a similar response. Perhaps not 1 in 100 communists living in the West was an active Soviet spy back in the 50s, and maybe not 1 in 100 Muslim immigrants is an active bin Laden asset. Nevertheless, managing the communist risk 50 years ago entailed denying entry visas, let alone permanent residences, college training, or passports, to self-avowed party members. Doing the same now with bin Laden's potential recruits seeking to enter the West is the key to any serious anti-terrorist strategy. Like communism, Islam relies on a domestic fifth column, the Allah-worshipping Rosenbergs, Philbys, Blunts, and Hisses, to subvert the civilized world. It also relies on an army of left-wing fellow travelers who sympathize with Islam, partly because it is a leading historical rival of the Western civilization they hate, and partly because they long for a romanticized and sanitized Muslim past that substitutes for the authentic Western roots that they have rejected. Those roots must be defended, in the knowledge that those who subscribe to Islam and its civilization are aliens, regardless of their clothes, professions, or residences. Until some decades ago, both the West and the Muslim world could define themselves against each other in a cultural sense. What secularism has done is to cast aside any idea of a Western social, geographic, and cultural space that should be protected. European birth rates have collapsed. Muslim ones have remained high. Very soon, the West will face two alternatives: defense or submission, and acceptance of sacred Arab places as its own. The challenge remains how to prevent terror from winning support, and how to prevent it from sheltering behind secular liberal toleration. While it is proper for democratic governments to refrain from legislating the practice of religion, Islam is a special case because it is, on its own admission, much more than just a religion. Islam needs to be understood and subjected to the same supervision and legal restraints that apply to other cults prone to violence and to violent political hate groups whose avowed aim is the destruction of our order of life. The collective striving embodied in We the People makes no sense unless there is a definable people to support it. Those Muslim immigrants who want to keep their wives' and daughters' heads covered at all times, and who believe that the Quran is the highest law given to man, have no kinship with the striving and no connection to the American people, except for the desire to partake in its wealth, or possibly to take over the country and the property, wives, children, and lands of the native population. But their deep disdain for the democratic institutions of the host societies notwithstanding, Muslim activists in non-Muslim countries invoke those institutions when they clamor for every kind of indulgence for their own beliefs and customs. They demand full democratic privileges to organize and propagate their views, while acknowledging to each other that given the power to do so, they would impose their own beliefs and customs and eliminate all others. And this is exactly the repetition of behavior of communist activists of 2 generations ago. Once it is accepted that true Islam does not recognize a priori the right of any other religion or world outlook to exist, least of all the atheistic secular humanism, a serious anti-terrorist strategy may become possible. The current terrorist threat to the United States, I need to reiterate, comes almost exclusively from the members of the Muslim community, and that community has been growing by leaps and bounds. In 87 to 97, 8% of all immigrants, about 2 million, came from predominantly Muslim countries. In 2000, 10.6 million were naturalized citizens, over 1 million of them were Muslims. The growth of overall immigration, legal and illegal, since 1970 has been 300%. But growth of immigration from the Middle East during the same period has been 700%. That population grew from roughly 200,000 in 1970 to 1.5 million in 2000. Expected number of immigrants from the Middle East in 2010 in the United States will be 2.5 million. Muslims among Middle Eastern immigrants in 2000 accounted for 73%, and by 2010 will account for over 90%. And finally, US-born children under 18 with at least one parent born in the Middle East in 2000 accounted for roughly 570,000, while in 2010 there will be close to 1 million of them. Therefore, critical to reducing the chance of an attack in the future is an immediate moratorium on all immigration from the risk nations, an expansion of the border patrol to the point of zero porosity, a radical reduction of visas issued to nationals of states that harbor or produce terrorists, abandonment of any amnesty debate, and the swift and rigorous deportation of all illegal aliens, especially those from nations that threaten America. Let's face it, unless these measures are adopted, the so-called war on terror is a sham. We are being indoctrinated into the dogma that the trend of immigration is inevitable, that economically motivated, unceasing immigration from the third world on a vast scale is unstoppable. That's simply not true. Free citizens must not submit their destiny and that of their progeny to a historicist fallacy. Immigration from Islamic nations, and indeed all others, can and should be subject to the democratic will of the American people. They have every right to defend themselves and their way of life. The struggle against terrorism has to start with knowing thy enemy. A new paradigm on Islam, immigration, and the Western identity is needed. All will be in vain unless murderous Islamic extremism manifested on September 11th does not spell the end of another kind of extremism, the insistence of the liberal establishment on treating each and every newcomer as equally multiple in the pot. Reducing and gradually ending unnecessary and harmful dependence on Middle Eastern oil is probably the easiest to achieve of all prerequisites for the policy of survival. In longer-term strategy, a wider paradigm shift is needed, based on the need for a genuine northern alliance of Russia, Europe, and North America. Russia should be the West's bulwark against the real threat to our common security, stretching along the West's vulnerable eastern flank from the Caucasus to the Pacific, as we enter the century that will see a new assault of militant Islam on an enfeebled Europe. Yes, Islam has an inherent advantage over the tepid ideology of multicultural mediocrity, in that it offers Allah in the place of nothing. Its adherents should not be condemned for maintaining their traditions. We should blame ourselves for refusing to acknowledge the facts of the case and failing to take stock of our options. People did not take Mein Kampf seriously, at their own peril. The Quran's exhortations to the believers to annihilate the non-believers, to confiscate their land and their property, to take their women and enslave their children, are equally frank and the fruits visible through the centuries. There is a huge problem for all Muslims. It's the violent message of the Quran. We cannot solve it for them, and we should not be asked to deem the problem solved by pretending that the Quran is a pacifist tract. Humans are perfectly capable of reinterpreting scripture when absolutely necessary. But until the petrodollars support a line of Islamic exegesis that can renounce the ideals of jihad, terror, tax, and subjugation, we must have the guts to call this religion of war by its right name. The real problem of the Muslim world is not that of natural resources or political systems. French historian of religion Ernest Renan, who started his study of Islam by praising its ability to manifest what was divine in human nature, ended it a quarter of a century and 3 long tours of the Muslim world later by concluding that Muslims are the first victims of Islam, and that to liberate the Muslim from his religion is the best service that one can render him. In the final analysis, Islam should be seen as a collective psychosis seeking to become global, and any attempt to compromise with madness leads to becoming part of the madness oneself. No one who believes that jihad is the right or duty of all Muslims, or who promotes adoption of Sharia law or re-establishment of the caliphate, should be allowed to settle or even set foot in any Western country. But back to illegal immigration. It's of course a desirable objective per se. In the context of stopping terrorists, it is absolutely mandatory. No counter-terrorist strategy is possible without physical control of our borders. Illegal immigration from Islamic nations, and indeed from all others, is a threat that can and should be subjected to the letter of the law. Current immigration trends, including illegal immigration, cannot be tolerated either for reasons of greed by those taking advantage of depressed blue-collar wages, or in the name of the false dogma that they're inevitable because of inexorable global market forces. The 9/11 Commission's final report says, quote, "Better technology and training to detect terrorist travel documents are the most important immediate steps to reduce America's vulnerability to clandestine entry," unquote. That is incorrect. Better technology is certainly needed, but the most important immediate steps demand controlling the borders, knowing who is already in the country illegally, expelling them, and stopping illegal newcomers is the highest priority. State and local law enforcement agencies should not be subjected to a single command and control center, but they need to cooperate in enforcing the law and protecting national security. Another specific policy proposal that I have is to discard the irrational ban on so-called profiling. Not all Muslims are terrorists, but for some years now, all terrorists of concern to America's national security and to the quality of life of its citizens have been Muslim. The development of terrorist indicators has hardly begun, the 9/11 Commission's report says, and behavioral clues remain important. That is of course correct, and it is therefore time to accept that profiling based on a person's appearance, origin, and apparent or suspected beliefs is an essential tool of trade, of law enforcement, and war on terrorism. Another proposal should be to enact new immigration legislation which would exclude all persons engaged in Islamic activism from the United States. Such activism will be defined as propagating, disseminating, or otherwise supporting jihad in its primary sense of divinely sanctioned war against non-Muslims, as well as advocating, propagating, disseminating, or otherwise supporting discrimination against non-Muslims, such as Christians and Jews, discrimination and violence against women and sexual minorities, anti-Jewish and anti-Christian bigotry, sanction of slavery, poll tax, etc. Islam's violent manifestations and discriminatory message are inseparable, and adequate safeguards against the adherence of that message need to be put in place. The proposed definition of Islamic activism would be a major step in the direction of denying actual or potential terrorists a foothold on our shores. Connected with this proposal is the need to treat resident aliens or prospective visitors, known or suspected adherents to an Islamic world outlook, as excludable with no right of appeal. In other words, we need to treat Islamic activism as grounds for the loss of acquired U.S. citizenship and deportation, for the loss of permanent residence, the so-called green card, and deportation, and for the denial of any kind of visa. The broad model is provided by the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA, the McCarran-Walter Act. Personal assurances by individuals thus excluded cannot be taken at face value. Islam not only allows but mandates lying to infidel in order to gain political or any other advantage. It's called taqiyya, the concealment of one's Islamic beliefs to non-Muslims, and subterfuge. In addition, even lapsed Muslims are at permanent risk of going back to their roots, as many Western-born youths are doing. The citizenship of any naturalized American who preaches jihad, discrimination against infidels and women, the establishment of the Sharia law, etc., should be revoked and that person promptly deported to the country of origin. In addition, it is necessary to mandate registration of Islamic centers and their individual members with the Attorney General, and subject them to legal limitations and security supervision that applies to cults prone to violence and hate groups. All over the Western world, Islamic centers have provided platforms for exhortations to the faithful to support causes and to engage in acts that are morally reprehensible, legally punishable, and detrimental to the host country's national security. The model for the proposed measure exists in the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950. Furthermore, it is necessary to treat Islamist activism as the grounds for the exclusion or deportation of any alien, regardless of status or ties, as prejudicial to the public interest and injurious to national security. Useful precedents for that exist too. Keeping out and facilitating the expulsion of politically undesirable foreigners has been at the heart of this country's immigration legislation ever since 1903, when Congress barred the admission of anarchists in response to President McKinley's assassination. Ideological grounds for deportation were on the statute books until 1990, when they were repealed by Congress. After the Russian Revolution, foreign communists were singled out for deportation. One night alone, in January of 1920, more than 2,500 alien radicals were seized in 33 cities across the country and deported to their countries of origin. Those who preach jihad and Sharia can and should be treated in exactly the same manner. And finally, it's necessary to treat affiliation with Islam as grounds for denial or revoking of any level of security clearance. Affiliation with Islam is incompatible with the requirements of personal commitment, patriotic loyalty, and unquestionable reliability that are essential in the military, law enforcement, intelligence services, and other related branches of government. Presence of practicing Muslims in any of these institutions would present an inherent risk to the integrity of that institution and would undermine its morale. Let me summarize specific policy proposals. 1. Seek zero porosity of the nation's borders. 2. Discard the irrational ban on profiling. 3. Enact new immigration legislation to exclude all persons engaged in Islamic activism from America. 4. Treat an alien's adherence to an Islamic world outlook as excludable. 5. Treat Islamic activism as grounds for the loss of acquired U.S. citizenship and deportation to the country of origin. 6. Mandate registration of Islamic centers and their individual members with the Attorney General and subject them to supervision that applies to cults prone to violence. 7. Treat Islamist activism as the grounds for the exclusion or deportation of any alien regardless of status or ties. 8. Treat affiliation with Islam as grounds for denial or revoking of any level of security clearance. Acceptance of these proposals would represent a new start in devising long-term defense against terrorism. The proposed measures recognize that we are in a war of ideas and religion, whether we want that or not, and however much we hate the fact. They reflect the seriousness of the struggle. This war is being fought on the Islamic side with a deep conviction that the West is on its last legs. The success of its demographic onslaught on Europe enhances the image of a candy store with a busted lock, and that view is reinforced by the evidence from history that a civilization that loses the urge for self-perpetuation is indeed in peril. These proposals are politically viable. They are likely to elicit an outcry from the elites, but the accusation of discrimination cannot apply to a proposal to exclude people not on the basis of their genes, but because of their ideas, actions, and intentions. Supporting these proposals will be a boon to any politician bold enough to embrace them. A poll sponsored by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations and the German Marshall Fund of the United States found considerable support, 79%, for a total ban on visitors and immigrants from Muslim countries, and our proposals are far from advocating such radical solutions. Other changes are needed too, but they concern wider issues that require changes in strategic thinking. The United States should reduce its dependence on Arab oil. It must stop appeasing jihadist ambitions in Chechnya and the Balkans. Neoconservative policy of global dominance, of which exporting democracy to the Middle East is but one manifestation, is self-defeating. Excessive support for one side in the matter of Israel-Palestine is irrational and in the long term detrimental even to Israel's own long-term security. But ultimately, the outcome of the war against terror will depend on our ability to define ourselves and to understand the nature of the threat. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles, says Sun Tzu. We know the violent message of the Quran. We cannot solve that message for the Muslims, and we should not be asked to pretend that the Quran says anything other than it does say. Those who submit to that faith must solve the problem they set themselves. Islamic terrorists have not simply replaced communists as the main threat to us, but both can be seen as two faces of the same menace, of the closed society and the closed mind. The totalitarian nature of Islam, akin to communism and Nazism, makes the threat different in degree to that America faced during the Cold War, but not in kind. It demands a similar response, and it demands the same courage.